The Assyrian war machine rolled across the ancient world like an iron fist, crushing everything in its path. City after city fell to their brutal siege tactics, their walls crumbling like sand before the tide. Their army was the most feared force on earth, a nightmare made flesh and bronze and blood. 185,000 soldiers camped outside Jerusalem's walls, their campfires stretching to the horizon like fallen stars. What if you stood on those walls and saw that endless sea of enemy tents glowing in the darkness? Inside the city, King Hezekiah knelt in the temple, his royal robes pooled around him like water. His hands trembled as he spread out the threatening letter from the Assyrian king before the altar of God. The letter mocked not just Jerusalem's defenses, but the very name of the God who dwelt among them. This was not just a military crisis, but a crisis of faith that would test every heart in the city. The Assyrian commander Sennacherib had already conquered 46 fortified cities of Judah with terrifying efficiency and ruthless precision. He had taken 200,000 captives, dragging them away in chains to serve in distant lands far from home. His message to Jerusalem was simple and chilling in its absolute confidence and brutal clarity. Surrender now, or watch your children starve while we drink from your wells and feast on your grain. He stood beneath the walls and shouted his taunts in Hebrew, so every citizen could understand their doom. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you with promises that your God will deliver you from my mighty hand. Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad, of Sepharvaim and Samaria, that they saved their people from destruction? The people on the walls stood silent, their faces pale as moonlight, their hearts heavy as stone. Have you ever felt surrounded by forces too great to fight, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide? Hezekiah's advisors urged him to negotiate terms, to buy time, to consider the impossible mathematics of survival. But the king tore his royal garments and covered himself with rough sackcloth that scraped against his skin like judgment. He sent messengers to the prophet Isaiah, a man whose words carried the weight of heaven itself upon them. Tell the prophet that this day is a day of distress and rebuke, a day when children come to birth, but there is no strength to deliver them. The city held its breath, waiting between the hammer of Assyria and the anvil of an uncertain divine response. Would God answer, or would silence be the only reply to their desperate prayers echoing in the temple courts? Isaiah's response came swift and sure, cutting through the fear like a blade of pure light through shadow. Do not be afraid of the words you have heard, the words with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. I will put a spirit in him, so that he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land with empty hands. But Sennacherib was not finished with his psychological warfare and cruel mockery of Jerusalem's hope and faith. He sent another letter, this one even more venomous, dripping with contempt for the God of Israel and his chosen people. Your God in whom you trust is deceiving you with empty promises when he says Jerusalem will not fall into my hands. Hezekiah took this letter and went up to the house of the Lord, spreading it before God like a wound opened for healing. He prayed not for military victory alone, but for the honor of God's name among all the nations of the earth. O Lord our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of earth may know that you alone are God. O Lord our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of earth may know that you alone are God. The Assyrian camp that night was a city of its own, filled with the sounds of soldiers sharpening swords and boasting of tomorrow's conquest. They had never lost a siege, never failed to breach a wall, never met a god who could stand against their king. Their confidence was not arrogance but experience, earned through 100 victories written in the ashes of fallen cities. They laughed around their fires, already dividing the spoils of Jerusalem in their minds like merchants counting coins. But in the temple, something else was stirring, something ancient and terrible, and beautiful beyond all human comprehension and understanding. The prophet Isaiah received a word from the Lord, and it burned in his mouth like a coal from the altar itself. The virgin daughter of Zion despises you and mocks you. The daughter of Jerusalem shakes her head behind your retreating back. Whom have you mocked and blasphemed? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes in prideful defiance? Because you have raged against me and your arrogance has come to my ears, I will put my hook in your nose. I will turn you back by the way you came, and you will not enter this city or shoot an arrow here. The night deepened over the Assyrian camp, and the soldiers settled into sleep, dreaming of gold and glory and conquest. Their sentries walked their posts, unaware that something moved through the darkness on wings they could not see or comprehend. The angel of the Lord passed through the camp like death itself, silent and absolute, and utterly without mercy for blasphemy. Not just one soldier fell, but thousands upon thousands in a single, sweeping judgment that left no corner of the camp untouched. 185,000 men who had mocked the living God lay dead before the dawn broke over the hills. There was no sound of battle, no clash of swords, no screaming of the dying echoing across the valley floor. Just silence, deep and terrible and complete, settling over the camp like a shroud woven from the fabric of eternity itself. When the first light of morning crept over the eastern hills, the watchmen on Jerusalem's walls rubbed their eyes in disbelief. The vast Assyrian camp lay still as a graveyard, no smoke rising from breakfast fires, no soldiers drilling in formation. Scouts were sent out, their hearts pounding with fear and hope warring in their chests like two wild animals. They returned with reports that seemed impossible, that defied all military logic and human experience and natural explanation. The entire Assyrian army was dead, their bodies lying where they had slept, their weapons still stacked beside their tents. Not by sword or spear or human hand, but by the breath of God himself sweeping through their ranks like wind through wheat. Sennacherib awoke to find his invincible army transformed into a field of corpses, stretching as far as sight could reach. The king, who had boasted he would drink the waters of Jerusalem, found himself drinking the bitter cup of absolute defeat. He fled back to Nineveh with the remnant of his forces, his pride shattered like pottery thrown against stone walls. Can you imagine the silence in his heart as he rode away from the city he swore he would destroy utterly? The Bible tells us he returned to his capital and worshipped in the temple of his god Nisroch, seeking answers from death idols. But even there, judgment found him, as his own sons struck him down with the sword while he bowed before his powerless deity. The king who had mocked the God of Israel died at the hands of his own children in his own house of worship. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, the people poured through the gates to see the miracle with their own eyes and trembling hands. They walked among the fallen Assyrians, touching the cold armor, seeing the faces frozen in sleep that became eternal rest. Children who had huddled in fear the night before now danced in the streets, their laughter rising like incense to heaven above. The elderly wept tears of relief and wonder, remembering the stories of God's deliverance in ancient days, now made new again. This was not just a military victory, but a revelation of who God is when his name is blasphemed and his people cry out. The prophet Isaiah walked through the city, and people reached out to touch his robe, thanking him for his faithful words of hope. But Isaiah pointed them away from himself to the God who had acted, the God who had heard their prayers in the darkness. What if the battles you face today are not yours to fight, but God's to win in ways you cannot imagine or predict? The water that flowed through Hezekiah's tunnel still runs today beneath Jerusalem's ancient stones, a witness carved in rock and time. The firelight of thanksgiving burned in the temple for days as sacrifice after sacrifice rose to heaven in grateful praise and worship. The stone walls that had seemed so inadequate against Assyria's siege engines stood firm, never tested by a single arrow or battering ram. News of Jerusalem's deliverance spread through the ancient world like wildfire racing across dry grass in summer heat. Nations that had feared Assyria's power now whispered in awe about the God who could destroy an army with a single angel's touch. The tribute that Hezekiah had desperately sent to Sennacherib before the siege was never mentioned again in the historical records. God had defended his city not because of Hezekiah's perfect faith, but because his name had been dragged through the mud of blasphemy. The king who had spread the threatening letter before God found that same God spreading his protection over the city like wings. This story echoes through the centuries, reminding us that no army, no empire, no power on earth can stand against divine purpose. The same God who acted that night still hears the prayers of his people when they cry out from places of desperation. He still defends his name when it is mocked, still moves in ways that confound human wisdom and military strategy and earthly power. The Assyrian Empire that seemed invincible eventually fell to dust, its palaces buried beneath desert sands for archaeologists to uncover. But the story of that night lives on, written in scripture and passed down through generations as a testimony of divine intervention. When you face your own impossible situations, remember the morning Jerusalem's watchmen looked out and saw God's answer spread before them. Remember that the battles that seem too great for you might be exactly the size God wants them to be, for His glory. The water still speaks of provision. The firelight still speaks of presence. The stone still speaks of promises kept through the ages. Hezekiah's prayer was not eloquent or lengthy, but it was honest, and it acknowledged that God's reputation was at stake in the outcome. Sometimes the most powerful prayer is simply spreading your impossible situation before God and asking Him to act for His name's sake. The 185,000 Assyrian soldiers fell, not because Israel was strong, but because God is faithful to His word always. Their defeat was not a tragedy, but a judgment, not a mystery, but a revelation of divine justice, executed in perfect timing. How does this ancient story speak to the giants you face today, that mock your faith and threaten everything you hold dear? Perhaps the answer is not in your strength or strategy, but in falling on your knees and spreading your fear before the living God. Perhaps the deliverance you need will come not through your fighting, but through God fighting for you, while you simply trust and wait. The night that angel swept through the Assyrian camp, heaven came to earth in judgment, and mercy intertwined like threads in sacred fabric. And every morning since, when the sun rises over Jerusalem, it rises over a city that learned what one night of divine intervention can accomplish. So when the armies of worry and fear and impossible odds camp around your heart, remember that God specializes in overnight victories beyond comprehension. Remember that the same power that struck down 185,000 enemies in darkness still moves in the world today with sovereign authority. And rest in the promise that when God decides to act, no force in heaven or earth can stand against His holy and righteous will.